a major whatever online event just between us and a few other friends. So thank you for
Yeah.
being a part of this, Tom.
So
Mm.
Monroe Holly was powerfully important to me, his book, and what a man. I also participated in the what's it was called, the Preacher's Fall Retreat up at Fall Hall Glen.
Yeah,
I think
yeah,
I was only able to go once or twice, but I've asked to be kept on the mailing list. And as it turned out, the time when they have it was just at the time when I've also had other commitments every year.
yeah,
And I've longed to go back because I enjoyed that camaraderie,
yeah.
although it could be difficult at times. But
Hmm.
you know what I'm talking about.
Sure. Yeah,
So
absolutely.
the Midwest Church of Christ folk had difficulties, huh?
Oh, well, it was if it would let me make a statement that's going to sound way too offensive. If it had just remained a bunch of northern folks, it would have been fine. But the southern transplants, which I love them to death, but they tended to bring a very harsh, rigid, legalistic point of view
Sectarian.
to things. Oh, yes, a sectarian. Oh my. And well, it is what it is. And now, Kent, the Dixon Church of Christ is no more. It closed 20 some years ago, and
Yeah.
I suspect that a lot of the work that had been done by people like Dale Smith, your dad, back in the 50s and 60s, and Monroe Hawley, it has diminished to nothing in some places, but it's still surviving in others. What's your understanding of the strength of those churches in this neck of the woods?
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair assessment. Like like churches across the different lines,
True.
there's just general demise and decline. I think that vision and model of church is finding less and less traction in the hearts of even the people that originally were engaged in it. And of course, the next generations haven't found any real appeal there at all for the most part. So yeah, we're looking at Karen and I visited Europe in 2002 and had a kind of a deep dive look into um, sort of the post-Christendom world of especially British Christianity, but really across the continent. And it was a great wake-up call for us there about what was happening. We were all already observing, by that point here in the States, but it's just accelerated. And of course, COVID has taken the acceleration and put it on probably jet fuel or something. It just seems
It
like
did.
people are leaving in droves at this point, which I think is one of the fascinating confluences of history with your work, Tom, because I think what that has done through no planning of any of ours has created this vast hunger for, well, if not that, then what? And I think especially for people who are particularly drawn to being faithful to Scripture and the early Christian uh, tradition and heritage, the the words that you're sharing, I think, really are a breath of fresh air and probably in many ways very eye-opening and emancipating for folks.
Yeah.
I would love to hear your reflections on kind of how you see your work kind of intersecting with these broader uh, kind of cultural and historical and religious realities that are kind of converging in our time.
Wow. That's a huge topic. Let me at least start with the way my content intersected with the Church of Christ environment in 1977 when I first preached this stuff. I was summarily declared a false teacher and a heretic, as you might imagine. And matter of fact, I I was after the controversy hit. I preached a sermon on this in October of '77 at the Averill Avenue Church of Christ in Flint, Michigan, which is where I was the pulpit guy. We had a large church then; it was about 330 people on average at the time. But I preached this sermon and it got recorded and it caused all kinds of trouble. About 8 months later, I was offered a position at Michigan Christian College in Rochester,
Yeah,
which you may be familiar with.
sure.
And I thought this is a great way to get out of this hot spot of being in the pulpit in a Church of Christ where I'm constantly under attack. And maybe there in an academic environment felt very comfortable to me. It was a long dream of mine, frankly, to do that. And here it came. Oh, this is wonderful. But the chairman of the board of trustees of Michigan Christian College, who I could name his name,
Mm.
got wind of my sermon and had a little cassette record player and it was cassette tape. And he demanded that the president and the vice president of the school get in his car and listen to this sermon, which he had in a little cassette recorder. And he, well, long story short, he made sure I was fired before I was actually hired.
Oh,
And
man.
so I never actually left Averill Avenue. That I'd already announced that I was leaving to go teach at Michigan Christian College, but he got me fired before I was hired. So that was one way that my content interacted at that time. And then I came back to Dixon in '79, and that's where I would have known people like you and the others associates who are known in that area at that time. Well, now let's fast forward to 50 years, or now, of course, churches are across the spectrum have lost lots of attendees. You may be interested to know that when I was in Dixon in 1981, it was a much smaller church. Attendance was only around 30. So I went from a church of 300 to one of 30. And I was curious of how many other churches in my town were small churches. And so I actually did a head count survey of all the churches in town to find out how many people were attending in each church.
Mhm.
And I was surprised to learn that half of the churches in Dixon at that time had an attendance of 75 or less, which I also learned was also the same as it was for all of North America. Half of
Right.
all churches were 75 or less.
Yeah.
Well, I have continued to do these church attendance studies in Dixon 8 different times from then until now, till last year. And I can trace head count counts of how many people are in the pews in all the churches in town for 40 years. And sure enough, attendance has dropped by 60%. Which doesn't surprise anybody, and that's been true across the board. So now to get to your other question about how does my stuff interact with people? Well, my videos have now been viewed probably by the end of today or the end of tomorrow, a total of 500,000 times. Like I'm right at 499 or something right now. Not that I'm watching this that closely, but it's sort of a mile mark, 500,000 times. And
Yeah.
they have been watched. Only 60% of my viewers are from the United States. Uh, of the top 10 cities viewing my stuff, only 3 of those cities are the United States. One of them is Dallas, by the way. But there's 3 cities in Australia that are in the top 10, 2 or 3 in South Africa that are in the top 10. London is another one of those. So, and I'm getting from these 500,000 views, I've received over 5,000 comments and emails via YouTube and just straight people finding my email address, which is not that easy to find, and then emailing me. And so I'm getting these reactions from Orthodox people, Eastern Orthodox, from Roman Catholic, from Quakers on the other end of the spectrum, from the Plymouth Brethren, from Methodists, Lutherans, everybody else in between. And some people are irate, especially Catholics and Orthodox folks are pretty upset.
Yeah.
And that's where I'm getting the newfound, I'm again finally being declared a false teacher and a heretic. It was, I took a 40-year absence from that, and now I'm back and I feel at home again. But then I'm getting enormous groundswell of support. People saying, "Wow, I've been thinking this for years, but finally you put it into words, and you've got some research to back it up." I'm getting enormous response from house church people saying, "Man, I mean, you're absolutely right, Wadsworth. The house church is where it's at, even though I'm not really advocating one over another, but I
Right.
get it. House churches is, well, it's where it's at. If you want to really grasp this content,
Mm,
a house church environment is the way
mm,
to do that. So
mm.
I answered your question with a much too long of an answer, but
Yeah,
that's a synopsis of what's been going on.
yeah. So encouraging and at one level astonishing and at another level not surprising to me at all. I think as I said, I think the hunger for if not this, then what is so great right now across the spectrum in the Christendom world and the post-Christendom world, really. Um, so I want to take you back to Harding undergrad, and I'm assuming you were a Bible major, but maybe not.
Yes,
Uh,
I was.
you were, okay.
And a New Testament Greek minor, by the way. I have to throw that in.
Who is your Greek professors? Do you remember names?
Yes, Brother Burke.
Brother
Um,
Burke. Oh, I
he,
love that man.
no kidding, had that funny eye, but
Yep, yep.
yeah, that's where I learned Greek from Brother Burke. Jack McKinney came in also to the Greek program. I think Brother Burke was starting to retire,
Yes.
and then I picked up at Harding grad with Carol Osborne.
Carol Osborne, sure.
Was very influential there as well.
Was Rick Oster there yet when you got there?
No, he came just as I left.
I thought so. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Rick's who I did my New Testament master's degree with. And of course, Carol was spent lots and lots of hours with Carol Osborne and Jack McKinney. So here's a hypothesis. I I learned of your work and then your PhD work just recently. A mutual friend of Bart's and I said, "Do you know Tom Wadsworth and his work?" And so, and then through multiple circles, I've been hearing about you from other people here just recently. Those 500,000 folks are talking apparently to each other. So, but I got to thinking. So I did exactly the same word study that you did,
Hmm.
and as I recall, I did it in as a senior in college. So I've been mulling whether McKinney, in some offhanded remarks in class, may have just said something that sparked that interest on my part and your part, because I drew the same precise conclusions. I mean, word for word, I learned early on in my preaching work that if I talked about this, I made people furious. But looking at proskuneo, looking at all of the offering words, all of the obeisance words, all of the kissing toward heaven words, all of the 12 or 13 cognates of various Greek words that get translated by the King James translators as worship, uh,
Hmm.
are unrelated to what is happening in the assemblies. I was there with you 40 years plus ago. And
Wow.
and so I have a feeling that somebody, I don't know if it's Osborne, but I think it was pre-Osborne, as I'm recalling, who may have said something to spark that curiosity. I don't think either of those guys ever camped on any of that, but um, I for some reason in Greek class, and the reason I remembered is because I'd had a knockdown, drag out fight with a really dear friend of mine as a junior over instrumental music, and lost a friendship really over it.
Mhm.
But it troubled me so much that I thought I need to go back and look at, what the actual original languages say about this stuff. And that's when I made the same shocking discoveries that you've made, and it's taken me on a really interesting trajectory. So anyway, just does that seem possible or even plausible to you that McKinney may have said something about this?
Uh, no, I did an independent study under Jack McKinney. It was on Acts 2:38.
Okay.
But so
Yeah.
it, but later on, if I'm not mistaken, Jack McKinney wrote an article about worship, and I believe I have that. I I don't recall him having an impact on me as saying the same thing,
Okay.
but really, my study came fresh after I was forced to preach on 1 Corinthians 14.
Yep.
And and I said, where is worship in this? And then that's when
Mhm.
I started
Yeah.
Genesis to Revelation, looking up the word worship.
Yeah.
And that's 47 years later, that's where I am. But yeah, it took me down a path that was a wild, a roller coaster ride through dangerous territory that nobody else was believing.
Mm.
Um, the one article that only in retrospect, I found it many years later, that of somebody who wrote something that was close to this, two articles. One was actually written in 1975 by Irvin Bishop. You recognize that name at all?
Rings a bell, but I'm not registering it.
Irvin Bishop wrote an article in the Restoration Quarterly in 1975, I'm pretty sure, that was called The Assembly.
Mm.
And I ended up calling him up after I stumbled on this same stuff because, and his article is really close to what we're saying. Uh, I asked him on the phone, I said, Irvin, how did you stumble on this stuff? And he said, I was in Greece and I was studying Greek as part of maybe a master's program or something. And he got invited to a wedding at a Greek Orthodox church. And he was watching what they were doing in this Greek Orthodox church. And he was saying, where in the world is all this stuff coming from? And that's when, because the Greek Orthodox, in a way, they're a lot like the Church of Christ at that time. They both felt they had restored New Testament
Right.
Christianity,
Right.
but the
Right.
similarity between those two assemblies was zero. They're diametrically opposite of one another,
Yep.
right? Uh, blew my mind. Anyway, that's where he started, and that's when he got into the Greek and all that. So his article is very good. But the second article I'll mention, then I'll shut up, is I. Howard Marshall.
Mm.
Ah, yes. Howard Marshall, the Dean of Evangelical Scholarship, wrote, he was the editor of Evangelical Quarterly for 25 years.
Yep.
Phenomenal writer and scholar, really did great work. But he wrote a little known article in 1985 in a little known little journal called Churchman,
Mm.
in which the title was, How Far Did the Early Christians Worship God? And
Mm.
he put worship, I think, in quotes, because he knew something's goofy here, something isn't right.
Yeah.
And but his article is very interesting. He doesn't exactly come to the same conclusions I do, but close. I just took it a whole lot farther and dug a little further and deeper into the whole thing than he did. But it was nice to have the support of a
Mm.
name like I. Howard Marshall. And I think a lot of doors have been opened for me thanks to that article by Howard Marshall.
Mm. Fascinating. Wow. Well, so I think one of my curiosities for you, Tom, is as people are coming to you, these 500,000 across the spectrum, and they're saying, and they're commenting and they're coming from wherever they're coming from in response, there's bound to be some subset of that group that are saying, so what are we supposed to do with this? And I'm curious about how you're responding to that question when it comes your way.
As I've told the story, in 2016 I went to into a doctoral program at Midwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Kansas City, and this was not online. Now, all the classes were on campus, and I was specifically going to work on this topic as my dissertation. And in any class I was in, I was going to try to study a different angle of it, whether I'm in Pauline epistles or in a a class about the Gospels or Revelation, whatever it is. And I would present this stuff in a paper to the classmates, all doctoral students. And of course, the teacher would be some sort of PhD in the New Testament. And a comment I had after 3 of these papers that I got in 3 different sessions, these guys looking at me stunned and saying, what do we do now?
Hmm.
And so that's what you said, and what do we do now? And so that was actually what I titled video number 7 in my series of 7 videos that are on YouTube now. What do we do now?
Hmm.
And I listed 9 steps of what do we do now there. And I actually have it in front of me here. Number 1 is change terminology, because this worship terminology has sent us in the wrong direction.
Right.
In fact, as offensive as that may sound to millions of people, it just has. We need to change terminology. What would it be like if every day or every weekend we went to church at an edification building, and we said, let us open our edification session with prayer. And what if we had an edification team at the front? Let's change our terminology to where it's biblical. So that's one thing. I said, make edification the purpose of going to church. That's number 2. We all think it's worship, but that's not what Paul says. It's not anywhere found in the New Testament that worship is it, but edification is explicitly. Number 3 was less concert, more content. Trying to get away from this worship band thing with these rock stars up there on the stage. Number 4 was more speakers, shorter speeches. Number 5 is more dialogue, less monologue. Number 6 is break big groups into small groups. That's where the house church makes sense. Number 7 was create edification rooms. We've all got houses of worship that were built for worship with these tall spires and the stained glass windows and whatever else. It was intended with the pews all facing forward at some pulpit. They were built for worship. But what if you built a building or even a special room for edification? What would that be? Number 8 was to incorporate the meal. The Lord's Supper was a supper. It wasn't this token thing. And we've all known for a long time that fellowship happens wonderfully around a meal, especially when it's accompanied by good Christian discussion. So food
was actually love in practice, you're saying.
Yes, exactly. And that was number 9, is make love an assembly mandate. 1 Corinthians 13 is in the midst of a discussion of the assembly. It was intended to be applied to assembly activity. When people are saying stuff you might disagree with, or people are talking too long, love them anyway. It could be love endures forever. Love overlooks all things. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is all those things that need to happen in the assembly. But our church culture has created a big room of critics who just critique everything going on and go home and have roast preacher. And, I heard that in the Church of Christ years ago. But we've created this environment, whereas this house church, loving, compassionate, close fellowship, relationship building, one anothering environment tends to breed a different kind of person. And that's the focus of, I think, really everything I'm doing. What I think the big change that ends up taking place if people grasp this stuff is that we all end up being different people, better people. Because if you go to church every week for years with the express purpose of building up one another, I think you can end up somebody different than somebody who goes to church every week for 40 years to worship God.
Yes.
Anyway, you get it. I don't
Yeah.
need to preach that sermon.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a well-oiled message at this point, and it needs to be. It's so powerful. So I would love to respond, if that would be all right, to what you're saying.
Please. Yes, I'd
Because
love to hear what you're thinking. Please
I
disagree as well. I love whatever you have.
well, so I would love to start with your core one of your core premises, which I understand to be the idea of edification, that 1 Corinthians 14 thing that, as you point out, is not just there, it's really right through Paul and the earliest Christian understanding of what this is all about. And as I've been trying to unpack the implications over now 35 years of teaching at the graduate level at ACU and working with mission teams going around the world, but mostly for North America. Working with teams is over the last 15 years in a sort of graduate residency program. One of the things that has become clear to me is that we're blind to a core challenge that is built into the word oikodomeo, which is the root of that, oikos. Because in the ancient world, as you know well, in the Mediterranean world, the oikos was not just where you lived, it was your entire life. It was your household. It was the context in which you lived, worked, ate, uh, fought, retired, were born. And it wasn't just mom, dad, and the kids. It wasn't family in the sense that most Americans think about it. It wasn't just a nuclear family. It was our extended family, along with maybe some folks that live and work with us in our family business. It was this normal lifestyle for people, whether they were Jewish or Gentile, whether they were fishermen or the rulers of a region, in the case of a Herod or a Caesar. The household was the matrix in which the ancient Christians lived and worked and had their being. And Jesus predicted that for many of them, that household would go away when they declared their allegiance to him. When they came home and said, Mom and Dad, I've decided to follow the true Christ, the true Messiah, Jesus, the crucified Savior. Mom and Dad would, in many cases, say, well, you've denied the true faith. You've become a threat to our family business. You are a shame to everything that we are and stand for. You're not part of this family anymore. And Jesus, knowing that, said, if you lose father, mother, brother, sister, lands, fields, for my sake and for the sake of the kingdom, in this world, you'll have many times as much, and in the world to come, life, right? So he anticipates what's going to happen to people who, in the ancient Mediterranean world, give up their household, their extended family. And that is precisely how the earliest church obviously begins to unfold then in the Roman Empire against great opposition. These micro village ecosystems of God's love form, and it's God is our Father, Jesus is our brother, the Spirit is our guide, and we are truly brothers and sisters in this new family. And that became the matrix in which the earliest church was born and grew and ultimately thrived. And that is not the reality of 21st century people anywhere, but especially in the developed Western world. So we've got a problem, because when Paul says the reason you get together is to build one another up, to encourage each other, it's the building up of the household, as you kind of suggested in the bits of your work that I've gotten to follow. But they think that is the life in which they have been embedded. It's not an event per se, though there obviously are events. It is a way of life. So all of those one another's, you've preached through those passages. I have. All of those one another's make splendid sense in the context of a community that is living life together, and they make almost no sense in a community that's meeting together once in a while or once a week, and in a context that would be analogous to most people's notion of church or church service.
Yeah.
Um, and so our challenge is theological for sure, and it's uh, pneumatological. Across the theological spectrum, it's a problem of categories and thought, but it's also a problem of wineskins, of structure, of how you actually imagine this thing that Jesus has invited us into. And so, as you know, to bring this down to earth, in 2002, my wife, as I mentioned, Karen and I were in England for a year, and we'd been working in the grad school here for a dozen plus years at that point. But I was more and more persuaded that trying to form teams, trying to help teams come together, Americans are horrible at working together in teams. You know, I don't know if you know the name Stanley Shipp. Does that name ring a bell with you?
Yes. Wow. That's a blast from the past. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Stanley, of course, had been doing mission teamwork development over, he had this internship in St. Louis that was well known, and many, many dozens of people had gone through that over the years. And so as I was beginning my work at ACU, training North American and overseas missionaries, I sat down with Stanley one day when he was in town. They were old friends of our families, and I said, Stanley, what have you learned in all these? He was probably 70 at the time. What have you learned in all these years of forming uh, mission teams? And I don't know if it was just a bad day or what, but he said, Kent, the thing I've learned is that North Americans don't know the first thing about working together as a team. And I thought, well, that's a kind of a cynical response. But, decades into that work myself, I think he was spot on. He understood kind of a core problem that we have, which is that we are generations away from understanding the radical interdependent and intergenerational lifestyle that was a given in the first century and has been for nearly all of human history across the face of the planet. Nearly all peoples have grown up in extended family contexts for most of history. It was not just mom, dad, and the kids. It was mom, dad, aunts and uncles, grandparents. It was the babies and the teenagers, and it was the whole spectrum in a walkable world where you grew up mostly being known and seen and heard and understood, and with people that, for the most part, cared about who you were and what you were becoming. And however flawed and broken that system was in the ancient oikos or in the tribal kind of uh, and clan groups of hunter gatherers, or in the village life of more agrarian civilizations, extended family has been a given, and it was a backdrop for everything that was being written in the New Testament about the nature of this new life in the family of God, in the oikos of God. Um,
Brothers
and
and sisters.
brothers and sisters, and not just sort of metaphorically, but people who would go to the mat for you would have your back no matter what.
Yeah.
That means that we've got a different challenge. I think 100 years ago in America, I often use the metaphor of the Waltons because that old television show depicted sort of an idealized version of American life in the 20s and 30s. Sort of, there's mom and dad and the kids, but there's also grandma and grandpa, crotchety old grandpa and grandma, and some aunts and uncles and cousins, and everybody's working on the family sawmill, and we're sharing 3 square meals a day together, and we're working through issues with our family for the most part growing up, and we're rubbing off on each other, and we're fighting, but we're working through the fights, and we're becoming who we are. We're discovering, in the case of John Boy, that I love to write and I can write, and it makes a difference for people. And we're in a place where we're seen, we're heard, we're understood, and we're in a context where human life is meant to flourish. So um, when we invite people in the 21st century who, in the 40s and 50s, especially after World War II, but even before that, really after World War I, people are moving out away from the family farm into cities. They're beginning to form the new ideal of the nuclear family, mom, dad, and the kids in the suburbs. Um, but where in a much more brittle family system, things begin to fall apart, especially as you again move from one adult wage earner to two adult wage earners. And by the end of the 60s, 70s, 80s, especially into the 90s, more and more children are being raised by single parents. And then by the 2000s, more and more children are functionally raising themselves with the help of the
Mm.
World Wide Web. Um, some of the core skills of human interacting, of loving, the cut to the chase, some of the core skills of the capacity to attune to another person, to see them, to hear them, to understand them, to be glad to be with them, even when they're working through hard things, and to convey to them, I'm with you, and we're going to work through this together, which are neurobiological necessities, according to current neuroscience. Humans are on a quest for that begins in the earliest hours of their life as infants connect with a present caregiving mother or father. And what happens when a present caregiving mother and father begins to go away? When mom and dad are too distracted or too addicted or uh, too absent to fulfill those functions? Well, we begin to develop a culture that's with malformed right prefrontal cortexes that don't know the first thing about love and the first thing about what it takes to receive love and to extend love and to mature into human life as it's meant to be. So all of that is sort of a rant, but I think it presents, from my perspective, a a clear lens about the challenge of doing what you're suggesting, especially if we're trying to confine it to an hour or two a week. If we stop dominating our gathering times with preaching and singing, if we stop dominating with sages on the stage and we begin to create space to interact, well, what do you do with a whole congregation that has no clue how to interact? What do you do with a whole congregation that has no clue what it's like to actually be present for other people and to draw out the gifts and the graces that are there? What if we're just completely below square one on how to begin to do this? And that set of issues launched me into some experiments that I'll be happy to tell you a little bit more about. But let me pause there. That's a bit of a long-winded response to your wonderful outlining of some of what you've been learning. Is that making sense to you at all, Tom?
A ton of sense. And I've recognized for some time that the fundamental weakness of everything I'm saying is that I've never tried it. I mean, I can identify what's going on in the New Testament. I can see all these words, this one anothering and this edification. I see all that. It's all clear. And I can
Mm.
see that we're not really doing that today. But what I've not done is do it,
Yeah.
or nor have I seen it done. I think house churches get as close as it gets
Mm.
to
Mm.
doing it. But even though sometimes people will have a house church that simply replicates a worship service.
Honey, I
Okay.
shrunk the church.
What's that?
Honey, I shrunk the church.
Yes, exactly.
Bad
So
preaching.
yeah. So, but yeah, there's a real fundamental weakness there, and I long for somebody to teach me. I know that I've been leading small group Bible studies for 40 some years, and those things work.
Mhm.
Um, I do know that once in a while there'd be people who just don't, who will leave it. It's not as though it appeals to everybody.
Yeah.
So I know that it's there's that. But I do know that in order to start to build relationships, you have to let people speak, letting them vent, letting them ask questions, letting them object.
Yeah.
But if they can speak about what they're thinking, they're likely to grow through the process, and we're also likely to build relationships through that. So those are some of the things I have learned, but only on an experiential level with
Yeah.
sort of these guidelines of New Testament teachings that are there giving us. But you've touched on, I think, the fundamental environmental problem that we have today,
Yeah.
not just in talking about the walls around the room, but what's been happening to people in people's lives, and they don't know how to love each other anymore. The family breakdown has really dramatically affected that. But one thing it has done, it has also created, I think, uh, a deep hunger for relationships.
Yeah.
People trying to find it social media, but that's so brutal sometimes.
Yeah.
But they really long for a connection, a human connection. And I
Yeah.
think that's what the church has always intended to offer. It doesn't really get it in a big worship service, in a house of worship,
Mhm.
but in a home,
Yeah.
yeah, this can happen.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. Well, back in 2008, a friend of mine, John White, and I, we had been experimenting for 5 or 6 years. There was an organization you may have heard of called Discipling a Whole Nation, Dawn, which was a church planting organization working a lot overseas, but it kind of grew out of some of the evangelical work of the Southern California West Coast Christians. But there, uh, John and I had worked for about 5 years or so with the North American branch of Dawn, experimenting with how do we help people begin to think about church planting in a different way. And uh, in 2007, Dawn came to an end, and John and I decided that the work that we had started, we wanted to continue. So we formed this little organization called LK10, Luke 10, for the chapter in the scripture where Jesus sends out the disciples in pairs. And uh, we began to experiment with how to begin to train people in sort of the core skills of connecting deeply with one another and then with the Lord, with sort of the premise that Jesus is Emmanuel, that God is here with us. Even in this conversation, Jesus is here and he's at work. And if we're paying attention, we can learn from Jesus together. So we ran a series of experiments. We developed different kinds of curriculum for people to learn online. And eventually we came up with a little 6 week, it's now 6 weeks process we call Church 101. So if you go to the lk10.com website, you can see a little bit about Luke 10 and its invitation to people to begin thinking the skill training, basically, I would say. We've written several books, and one most recently called The Relational Revolution, in which we outline 5 core values that we think are going to be critical for recovering church's heart-to-heart connection, along the lines of what you're suggesting there. And it's been really well received, and we're in, I think, over 40 countries now around the world.
Wow.
But the thing that's so striking, and we get these stories weekly, daily now almost, is working with people who are our age, in their 60s and 70s, who are saying, I've been a leader in the church, I've been a pastor, I've been an elder, I've been on the board my whole life. And in these 6 weeks, I've come to feel closer to this group that I'm training with than I feel with people that I've known for decades. And so we're just getting, and then for people who decide after that they want to continue to train in what we call a community of practice, they can sign up for an ongoing every 2 week kind of a group. And the point of these is not to become sort of the end in themselves, but to continue to provide people who have not been trained in these relational skills in how to do that, so that in their own family, in their own husband and wife relationships, with their children, with their grandchildren, with their friends and neighbors, they can begin to create what my language is, the ecosystem of grace. So I love taking oikonomia, that wonderful early Greek word that describes sort of the household operating system or economy of the household, which was people sharing life at every level, right? It's not just financial sharing. It's we get the English word economy from it, but I think ecosystem is a better translation, because it contains, the idea of a community of shared resources, and it's an interdependent community of shared resources. So we're sharing gifts back and forth with one another of every kind. Um, so anyway, Luke 10, I would love for you to explore a little bit about Luke 10, because I would love for you, on occasion at least, to be able to say to someone who personally is asking, well, how can I get started on the skills to do this, to have an answer for them, uh,
Hmm.
and to be able to point them to our website, or to and I mean, warmly invite you to check it out yourself and see what tools are there, and maybe even try some on for size, just to be able to, credibly say, well, I've looked at this and it looks like it's well grounded in what I understand the early Christians to believe and to practice. So again, that's an invitation more than anything, but just um, you and I have been on, in many ways, parallel paths. You've been working out some of the, I think, critically important teaching around this subject that obviously is really finding appeal at this point to lots and lots of folks who have the hunger you just described. And if there's any way that we can partner in a way that helps those questers come into a fuller understanding of what the next steps can be for them, then that would be a beautiful thing in my perspective.
Yeah, I love the idea. I do get asked the question, uh, Tom, what resources can you point us to help us know how to start to implement this? And I frankly don't have much of anything to
Yeah.
send them, but I'd love to be able to take a look at your work and see what we could be giving them this. This would be great because people
Yeah.
need guidance. And I've recognized this need for guidance. I know how to lead a group, if we're going to have a group. But it does take training.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about somebody needs to go off and get an MDiv somewhere.
Right.
That's not that important at all. But there's just a few other skills and uh, parameters that need to be aware of, and
Mhm.
priorities they need to be aware of, and they get those firmly in mind, then pretty much anybody can do this. With Second
Yes,
Timothy 2:2, find faithful men who will be able to teach others also, right?
indeed. Yep. Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Well, if you give me permission, I would love to send you links to a couple of articles that I've written that might be helpful, just kind of overview kinds of things. I wrote an article in Missio Dei years ago called Ecosystems of Grace, an Old Vision for the New Church, that I think you might find encouraging and useful. And then more recently, I don't know if you know the name Galen Van Reenen. He was a
Yeah.
yeah. So Galen was one of my coworkers here, a missionary in Africa. Still just a remarkable person. But we wrote a festschrift for him, and I took the opportunity to try to condense into a relatively short paper a lot of both the theology and the substance of how we're beginning to think about how to help um, attention deficit and relationally starved Americans think about how we enter into this life that Jesus was inviting us into so long ago. So if you're willing, I'd love to send you links to those articles and super value your feedback. And like you say, I'm happy to have pushback as well. It's that iron sharpening iron thing is real. And so anything you would like to say, but I'll also just provide you the links for Luke 10 and anything that you'd like to do by way of exploration there, including taking a look maybe at Relational Revolution, our most recent book. We wrote another book earlier called Joy Fueled, which has also been really well received. But Relational Revolution is a good overview of some of the lessons God's been teaching us about picking up with people kind of where you're bringing them to. I think you're just doing such a great job of bridging people into the real questions they need to be asking. And so, yeah, if there's a way we can partner, friend, I would love that. And you're still in Dixon all these years later.
Yes, I am. Yes,
That's
I am.
If I can jump
But
in real quick, and I'm very excited just to be a fly on the wall here today and hear two giants of faith meet and share notes. Real quick, my little story is Introduction to Kent is yeah, I was really interested to find out what house church could be, and I went to Abilene Christian and never met Kent, but it was years later here that we were introduced to each other. And so he, in my opinion, has taken a lot of these things and decided there's a need for a model. So he's connected with his wife with is it 10 couples or 5 couples in Abilene, Kent? How many are you?
about 6 right now, 6 or 7,
6,
yeah.
yeah.
Mhm.
And just being able to track his heart here a little bit. They came together. They have made a commitment. They've said, "We're doing this. We're as best as possible. We're living the oikos life in Abilene." And currently, they live not too far from each other in Abilene, almost walkable. But I had a chance to go out and see them. They've created a week in May where if one wanted to, you can go and be a part of a seminar that they put together called Regenerative Culture. Is that right, Kent?
Foundations of regenerative culture, yeah.
And so you get to hear some teaching, plus you get to be a part of their world for that week. And they have, on another level altogether, blown me away. This little small group, they've gone and purchased some affordable housing for people to live in Abilene, and that's the ministry of this little group. They've also purchased 100 acres outside of town and have a goal to build homes out there in the future. And, you know, that may be a little bit more than what I'm interested in or can perceive myself doing, but to go out to Abilene and to see, all right, let's see what some people here are trying to put into practice. That one week meant a lot to me. I came back and got to, put the notes and the cognitive into the experiential. And so anyway, I didn't know if you were going to tout that, Kent, but I thought I would throw that out there too. That's been a wonderful thing that you guys have done in Abilene. And we've had Kent up to we had a house church here for 7 or 8 years. And it was wonderful, the best church experience ever. And I've been a part of the mission team plants, Mexico, Argentina, different things, but never really and truly enjoyed church life like we did with taking some of these principles. We had him come up and teach us something called divine governance. And if you've never heard of that concept before, how do you make decisions as a small group? We were learning about it and practicing some of these things. And one day Kent said, "You might want to practice conflict resolution." And I said, "Nah, we love each other so much. There's no way we're going to have a conflict." And then COVID happened and we blew up.
Oh,
Anyway, there's a lot more to learn, and very humbled to be able to hear both of your stories today. So that was my little commercial, I guess. So.
Well, great. So please feel free to send me whatever you got. I'm very interested. One just reflective thought that comes to mind. You mentioned Gail and Van Reenen, and another thing I've noticed with all these responses I'm getting from around the world, it's the mission field
Mm.
where people had their eyes open to what's really needed for the gospel,
Yeah.
how the gospel really works in a real situation.
Yeah.
Because if we operate from the assumption that American Christianity's got it figured out, we just got to transplant that elsewhere, boy, is that wrong.
Yeah.
That's even sick.
Yeah.
But it isn't, it's always been in the mission field where you really learn what's really important about Christianity,
Hmm.
what it really means to people, how it needs to take effect and take root,
Yeah.
what the net effect of it is. Yeah, the mission field is where it's at.
Mm.
And there's these missionaries all over in tiny little communities, all over the rural areas around the globe.
Yeah.
They get it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And yet there are these big honcho preachers on these big stages
Yeah.
that don't get it, and
Yeah.
yet nobody hears those thousands of little missionaries
Yeah.
who get it, but
Yeah.
they hear the big voices all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So true. Yeah. Well said, friend. Well, what would it look like for us to live those beautiful household communities of the earliest Christians in our time? I think that's the that's the dilemma and also the hope, because it is being done. It can be done, but it has to be extraordinarily intentional in our time, because we start so far back in the process of understanding how to live this life of love that Jesus invited us into. But what a joy to meet you today, Tom, and to learn more of the journey you've been on, and to see how you've been faithfully walking that journey out with all the grace God's given you. What a pleasure to know you, brother.
Yeah, same here. Well, I mean, I could talk for another several hours here because this is most enjoyable to me, but we do need to wrap it up. And I really mean this. Let's really keep in touch here, and do
Yeah.
send me links to your LK10 stuff and
Okay.
any articles that may be helpful. And
Yeah.
what I'm most looking for, I want to be able to have something that I can give all the people who are saying, Tom, send us some resources to
Yeah.
how to get started on this, and that's what's needed.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Well, let me pray for us as we're wrapping up here, and we'll call it a morning. And Tom, I'm assuming that your email is in the links for the Zoom here, so I'll know how to track you down that way.
Yes, yes.
Okay, great. Well, Lord, what a pleasure to meet my brother, to get to be with Bart in this conversation. It feels like a divine appointment. Your good work. And I just love the confluence, the convergence of our stories, the ways that you've given us work to do that matters. Continue to lead us by your good spirit, Lord. And bless Tom's work in speaking these profoundly important truths to an ever-growing body of people whose hunger can be met with the good news of Jesus. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much, Kent, and good to talk to you, Bart. Thanks for connecting
Sure.
us. This is very enjoyable.
My pleasure.
Bless you,
Thanks,
friends.
guys.
Bye for now.
All right,
Bye now.
guys. See ya.